For most of the 20th century, Venezuela occupied a position that many developing countries could only envy. It possessed a rare combination of geographic proximity to the world's largest consumer market and the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. In purely geological terms, Venezuela was not a poor country that failed to become rich. It was a rich country that failed to build the institutions required to remain stable. The discovery and rapid exploitation of oil in the early 20th century transformed Venezuela from a largely agrarian society into a petro-state within a single generation. By mid-century, oil exports had become the overwhelming source of foreign currency, government revenue, and economic identity. This transformation created the appearance of modernity, urbanization, and prosperity. It also created a structural dependency that would define every major economic and political decision for decades to come. Unlike diversified economies, where the state must tax a broad base of productive activity, Venezuela's government learned to finance itself primarily through oil rents. This distinction is not merely technical. A state that lives off taxation must, by necessity, maintain a functioning private economy. A state that lives off resource rents can survive even as domestic production weakens. Over time, this changes the nature of the political system itself. The government becomes less accountable to citizens as taxpayers and more focused on controlling access to the resource that generates the rents. By the 1970s, Venezuela had become a textbook example of what economists call a rentier state. Public spending expanded rapidly. Subsidies became a permanent feature of political life. Imported goods were kept artificially cheap. The population, in turn, experienced rising living standards without a corresponding increase in domestic productivity. Consumption grew faster than production, and imports steadily replaced local industry. This arrangement created a powerful illusion of stability. As long as oil prices remained high, the system appeared to work. The government could fund social programs, stabilize the currency, and maintain political support without undertaking the more difficult task of building a competitive, diversified economy. The private sector, increasingly unable to compete with cheap imports and state intervention, became progressively weaker. Over time, the country's economic structure narrowed instead of broadening. The deeper problem was not simply dependence on oil, but the way that dependence reshaped institutions. Political legitimacy became closely tied to the state's ability to distribute wealth, rather than to foster growth. Elections and political competition increasingly revolved around promises of spending, rather than plans for productivity. In this environment, long-term investment in infrastructure, education, and industrial capacity was consistently subordinated to short-term distribution. At the same time, the abundance of oil revenue encouraged the growth of a rent-seeking elite. Access to state contracts, import licenses, and currency allocations became more important than innovation or efficiency. The most profitable economic activity in the country was no longer production, but proximity to the state. This is a common pattern in resource-rich economies, and Venezuela followed it with remarkable consistency. The nationalization of the oil industry in the 1970s reinforced these tendencies. While the move was politically popular and symbolically powerful, it further concentrated economic power in the hands of the state. The National Oil Company became not just an energy producer, but the financial backbone of the entire political system. Over time, it was treated less as a commercial enterprise and more as a fiscal instrument for funding government policy. Crucially, none of these developments produced an immediate crisis. For decades, Venezuela appeared to be a successful case of resource-based development. Its cities expanded, its middle class grew, and its consumption patterns resembled those of far wealthier countries. This surface-level prosperity concealed a fundamental fragility. The entire economic model depended on a single external variable that Venezuela did not control, namely the global price of oil. In a diversified economy, a fall in one sector can be offset by growth in another. In Venezuela's case, there were no meaningful alternatives. Agriculture had been neglected, manufacturing had been crowded out, and the service sector was largely tied to state spending. The country had, in effect, become a one-industry economy with a highly complex distribution system built on top of it. This structural vulnerability was not hidden. It was discussed repeatedly by economists and policymakers over the years. But as long as oil revenues continued to flow, the political incentives to change course remained weak. Reform would have required reducing subsidies, cutting spending, and confronting powerful interest groups. Distribution was always easier than transformation.
By the late 20th century,
Venezuela had constructed a state that was exceptionally good at spending money and increasingly poor at generating it. The distinction would prove decisive. The crisis that eventually unfolded was not the result of a single election, a single leader, or a single policy mistake. It was the delayed consequence of a development model that prioritized immediate distribution over long-term resilience. Understanding this starting point is essential. Venezuela did not collapse because it lacked resources. It collapsed because it built an economic and political system that could only function under permanently favorable external conditions. When those conditions began to change, the weakness of the underlying structure would be exposed with remarkable speed. By the time Venezuela entered the 21st century, the foundations of its economic model were already fragile. What followed was not a sudden deviation from a healthy system, but the acceleration of long-standing structural tendencies. The state, which had gradually become the central actor in the economy, now began to absorb it almost entirely. The expansion of state control was justified politically as a correction to inequality and foreign influence. In practice, it meant a steady wave of nationalizations across key sectors: energy, electricity, telecommunications, steel, cement, food production, and transportation. Private firms were either expropriated, pushed into partnership with the state, or regulated so heavily that independent operation became nearly impossible. Within a few years, the government had become the dominant producer, importer, employer, and distributor in the country. This shift fundamentally changed how economic decisions were made. In a market system, prices, profits, and losses act as signals that guide production and investment. In Venezuela, these signals were increasingly replaced by political directives. Output targets, pricing, and investment priorities were no longer determined by efficiency or demand, but by political considerations. The result was not merely inefficiency, but a progressive loss of the economy's ability to coordinate itself. The transformation of the National Oil Company, PDVSA, illustrates this process with particular clarity. Once regarded as one of the most professionally managed oil companies in the developing world, it gradually became an instrument of political policy. Technical staff were replaced by loyalists, and operational priorities were subordinated to fiscal and social spending goals. Instead of reinvesting profits into maintenance and expansion, the company was used as a direct funding channel for government programs. This had predictable consequences. Investment declined, maintenance was deferred, and production capacity began to erode. For a time, high oil prices masked these problems. Revenue remained substantial even as the underlying productive base weakened. But the system was becoming increasingly hollow, still generating cash, but losing the capacity to sustain itself. At the same time, the government launched an aggressive campaign against what it viewed as speculation and unfair pricing. This took the form of extensive price controls on food, fuel, and basic consumer goods. In theory, these controls were meant to protect purchasing power. In practice, they ensured that many goods were sold below their cost of production. When producers cannot cover their costs, they reduce output or exit the market entirely. This is not a political statement, it is a mechanical economic outcome. As domestic production fell, the state attempted to compensate by importing more goods using oil revenue. The country thus moved even further away from self-sufficiency and deeper into import dependence. Currency controls compounded the problem. In an effort to prevent capital flight and stabilize the exchange rate, the government introduced a tightly controlled foreign exchange system. Access to dollars was allocated administratively rather than through the market. This created enormous distortions. Companies that could obtain official dollars at subsidized rates could import cheaply. Those that could not were often unable to operate at all. Inevitably, this system became a source of massive corruption. The difference between the official exchange rate and the market rate created an opportunity for arbitrage that was often more profitable than any productive activity. Entire business models emerged that were based not on producing goods, but on obtaining access to subsidized currency. Once again, proximity to the state mattered more than efficiency or innovation. Agriculture was among the hardest hit sectors. Price controls made farming unprofitable, while expropriations and regulatory uncertainty discouraged investment. Food production declined steadily, even as the country remained one of the most resource-rich in the world. By the early 2010s, Venezuela was importing a large share of its basic food supply. Manufacturing followed a similar path, with cheap imports favored by the exchange rate system and domestic costs rising. Local industry lost competitiveness. Factories closed or operated far below capacity. The economy was not just stagnating, it was losing complexity. Each year, fewer things were produced inside the country. Despite these warning signs, the system continued to function in a limited sense as long as oil prices remained high. The state could still pay for imports, subsidize consumption, and cover fiscal deficits. To the average citizen, the deterioration was gradual and often uneven. Shortages appeared sporadically. Inflation was present, but manageable. The deeper structural damage remained largely invisible. What had been built, however, was a highly centralized, highly fragile system. Almost all economic flows now depended on the state's access to oil revenue and foreign currency. Private buffers had been eliminated. Institutional resilience had been eroded. The economy no longer had independent sources of growth or adjustment. In effect, the state had not merely expanded into the economy, it had replaced it. And in doing so, it had also taken on a burden that no state can sustain indefinitely: the responsibility for producing, importing, pricing, distributing, and financing almost everything. This arrangement could survive only under one condition: a continuous and abundant inflow of external revenue. The moment that flow weakened, the entire structure would come under stress simultaneously. The system was no longer just inefficient, it was structurally incapable of adapting. By the early 2010s, Venezuela was no longer a diversified economy with a large public sector. It was a fiscal distribution machine attached to a deteriorating oil industry. The time bomb had already been built. The only unknown was when it would be triggered. When Venezuela's economic crisis entered its most visible phase, it was often described in political or moral terms. In reality, the core of the collapse was financial and arithmetic. Long before supermarkets emptied and savings became worthless, the country's monetary system had already been placed on an unsustainable trajectory. The first critical distortion was the creation of a multi-tier exchange rate system. Instead of allowing the currency to adjust to supply and demand, the government fixed several official exchange rates, each supposedly serving a different purpose: one for essential goods, one for selected industries, and another for more general transactions. The intention was to protect consumers and manage scarce foreign currency. The result was the opposite. Anytime a government sets an official price far below the real market price, it creates a shortage and an incentive for arbitrage. In Venezuela's case, access to dollars at the official rate became one of the most valuable privileges in the economy. Companies and individuals who could obtain these dollars could either import goods at artificially low cost or simply resell the currency at a massive profit on the black market. This was not a marginal problem. It became one of the central economic activities in the country. As more resources were diverted into exploiting the currency system, fewer resources were devoted to actual production. The exchange rate regime did not merely misallocate capital. It actively rewarded non-productive behavior. Over time, this further hollowed out the economy and increased dependence on imports. The second and more decisive problem was the state's fiscal position. As oil production weakened and prices became more volatile, government revenue began to fall. But spending did not adjust accordingly. On the contrary, political incentives pushed the system toward even higher levels of expenditure in order to preserve social stability and political support. With access to international capital markets increasingly constrained and domestic taxation structurally weak, the government turned to the only remaining source of financing: the central bank. In practical terms, this meant printing money to cover budget deficits. This mechanism, known as monetary financing, always produces the same result. It increases the money supply without increasing the supply of goods and services. At first, the effects appear manageable. Inflation rises, but not catastrophically. The government can still pay salaries, fund programs, and maintain the appearance of normality. But once the public begins to understand that money is being created faster than the economy can absorb it, expectations change. People try to spend currency as quickly as possible. Businesses raise prices not only to cover current costs, but to anticipate future ones. The velocity of money increases, and inflation accelerates. In Venezuela, this process fed on itself. Price controls prevented many prices from adjusting officially, which led to chronic shortages. These shortages pushed more transactions into informal and black markets, where prices reflected the real collapse of the currency. The official statistics became increasingly meaningless as the real economy migrated outside the formal system. Once this dynamic reaches a certain point, it becomes extremely difficult to stop. The government must print more money to cover the rising nominal cost of its own operations. That additional money further weakens the currency. The cycle repeats at a faster pace. This is the classic mechanism of hyperinflation, and it is driven not by ideology, but by accounting identities. The social consequences are severe and immediate. In an inflationary environment, money ceases to function as a store of value. Savings accumulated over decades can lose most of their purchasing power in months or even weeks. Wages, even when adjusted frequently, cannot keep pace with price increases. Contracts become meaningless. Long-term planning becomes impossible. The middle class is typically the first major casualty. Those who depend on salaries, pensions, or fixed incomes find that their economic position collapses rapidly. Those with access to real assets, foreign currency, or political connections are better able to protect themselves. The society begins to fracture along these lines. The banking system also becomes increasingly dysfunctional. In real terms, loans lose value, deposits shrink, and interest rates become irrelevant. Financial intermediation, one of the core functions of a modern economy, effectively stops working. The economy reverts to a form of survival-based transaction system, often using foreign currencies or barter-like arrangements. By this stage, the currency is no longer a reliable unit of account. Prices may change several times in a single day. Businesses cannot calculate costs. The state cannot plan budgets in any meaningful sense. What appears from the outside as chaos is in fact the logical endpoint of a prolonged period of fiscal and monetary indiscipline. It is important to emphasize that this phase of the collapse is not primarily political. Different governments, with different ideologies, have produced the same outcome under similar conditions throughout history. Once a state commits to financing large structural deficits by creating money, and once confidence in the currency is lost, the process becomes largely automatic. In Venezuela's case, the monetary breakdown completed the destruction of the domestic economy. Even where some productive capacity still existed, the financial system could no longer support it. The country did not merely suffer from inflation, it lost the basic monetary infrastructure that allows a complex economy to function. At this point, the crisis ceased to be a normal economic downturn. It became a systemic collapse. And as with all such collapses, the internal breakdown would soon intersect with external political and geopolitical constraints, further limiting the range of possible responses. Ever wondered what would happen if the money in your bank account suddenly became worthless? Sounds like a scene from a dystopian movie, but history is filled with examples of currency collapse. This isn't just about dusty history books. It's about understanding the fragile mathematics that underpins our entire economic system. And trust me, once you see the numbers, you'll never look at your wallet the same way again. So what exactly is currency collapse? It's not just a bad day on the stock market. It's a catastrophic loss of confidence in a currency, leading to hyperinflation, where prices spiral out of control so fast that your life savings could be wiped out in weeks or even days. Think of it like a mathematical equation gone horribly wrong. Let's break down the basic math. Imagine a country's government has a big pile of debt. To pay it off, they decide to print more money. Simple, right? Not really? This increases the money supply without a corresponding increase in goods and services. It's like adding more water to a glass of juice. The total amount of liquid increases, but the juice itself becomes weaker, less valuable. More dollars are chasing the same number of goods, so the price of everything skyrockets. This is where the mathematics of ruin kicks in. At first, inflation might be manageable, say 5 or 10%, but when people realize the government is just printing money endlessly, confidence evaporates. Everyone rushes to spend their money before it loses more value. The spending frenzy pushes prices up even faster, creating a vicious feedback loop. This isn't just theory. We saw it in Weimar Germany in the 1920s, where people used wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. We saw it in Zimbabwe in the 2000s, with inflation rates reaching mind-boggling numbers. And we're seeing alarming signs in various parts of the world today. The key mathematical concept here is exponential growth. Hyperinflation doesn't increase linearly. It compounds on itself, growing faster and faster. An inflation rate of 50% per month, which is a common definition for hyperinflation, means that prices double roughly every 50 days. Imagine your rent doubling every 2 months. Imagine the cost of your groceries doubling. Soon the numbers on the banknotes become meaningless, just zeros on paper. The entire economic structure built on that currency crumbles. Businesses can't plan, savings are obliterated, and society is thrown into chaos. So what's the takeaway from all this scary math? It's not about panicking, but about being aware. Understanding the dynamics of currency and the dangers of unchecked money printing is the first step toward financial literacy. It highlights the importance of having a diversified financial strategy, one that isn't solely dependent on a single government-issued currency. People throughout history have turned to tangible assets like gold, real estate, or even other, more stable currencies to protect their wealth during these crises. The mathematics of ruin is a powerful and often brutal force. It shows how quickly order can descend into chaos when the fundamental trust in our medium of exchange is broken. It's a stark reminder that the value of our money isn't just a given it, as a delicate balance that requires careful management and, most importantly, public confidence. Thank you for watching. If you found this breakdown of the economics of collapse interesting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces that shape our world. See you in the next video.